"Don't make this dramatic," Daniel said, standing in the middle of their living room with another woman wearing Olivia's grandmother's bracelet on her wrist. "We are adults. Handle this with dignity." He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was issuing instructions. 12 years of marriage, and he expected her to smile, step aside, and make up the guest room. If you've ever been told to be graceful while someone was breaking you, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel, follow Olivia's story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Olivia Carter had spent 12 years becoming very good at one particular skill, and it wasn't the charity fundraising, though she excelled at that too. It wasn't the dinner party hosting, though her events were legendary among Chicago's elite. It wasn't even the quiet diplomacy she practiced every time Daniel's temper flared in front of the wrong people, and she had to redirect the conversation before anyone noticed the storm behind his eyes. No, the skill. Olivia had perfected the one she had practiced more than any other, was the art of making her own pain invisible. She had learned it early in their marriage, back when Daniel was still building Whitmore Enterprises from a mid-tier commercial real estate firm into one of the most recognized development companies in the Midwest. Back then, she told herself his absences were necessary. She told herself the missed anniversaries were temporary. She told herself that a man building something great couldn't always stop to tend to the feelings of the woman standing beside him, and that her job, her purpose was to be steady, to be there, to be the kind of wife who never needed to be handled, never required reassurance, and never became a complication. So she became all of those things, and Daniel in turn became the kind of man who stopped asking whether she was all right. Not because he forgot to care, but because Olivia had made caring about her so unnecessary. She handled everything. She remembered everything. She smoothed every rough edge and filled every silence and stood smiling in every photograph until the photographs became the truth, and the truth, the version where she cried alone in the bathroom because he had missed their daughter's spring recital to take a client to dinner, became just a private inconvenience she carried somewhere behind her sternum. That was the architecture of their marriage. Beautiful from the outside, hollow from within. The night everything changed, Olivia had left the Mercy General Hospital Foundation meeting early. The agenda had run short because 2 of the board members were traveling, and the executive director had suggested they table the remaining items until the full committee reconvened. Olivia had agreed. She had smiled her way through the goodbyes, exchanged pleasantries in the lobby, and slipped into the back seat of her car, thinking about almost nothing at all. Maybe whether the housekeeper had remembered to reschedule the carpet cleaning. Maybe what she would eat for dinner, since Daniel had texted that morning saying he had a working dinner and wouldn't be home before 10. She did not call ahead. She never used to have a reason to. When the car pulled up to the house on Ashburn Lane, the 4-bedroom colonial that Daniel had insisted on buying because the neighborhood signaled the right things to the right people, Olivia noticed immediately that the lights were on in the front rooms. She noticed that there was a second car parked near the garage, a white Mercedes she didn't recognize. She noticed all of it and felt precisely nothing because her brain had already categorized it as something ordinary. A colleague, maybe. A late business conversation. Daniel had moved from the restaurant to home. She walked through the front door, and the world she had built for 12 years cracked straight down the middle. Daniel was standing near the fireplace, jacket on, drink in hand, completely at ease. And beside him, close beside him in a way that telegraphed everything, stood a woman Olivia had never seen before. She was younger, dark hair, a certain practiced ease in the way she held herself, like a woman who had been in this room before and expected to be in it again. She was wearing Olivia's bracelet. Not just any bracelet. The platinum and diamond bracelet that had belonged to Olivia's late grandmother, Eleanor. The one Eleanor had pressed into Olivia's hand during her final hospital stay and said, "This is not jewelry, baby. This is the part of me that doesn't die." The one Olivia kept in the velvet box in the back of her closet and wore only on the most significant occasions, because wearing it felt like a conversation with a woman she missed every single day. That bracelet was on a stranger's wrist, and Daniel was looking at Olivia with an expression she had never seen from him before. Not guilt, not panic, not even the careful, calculated remorse he sometimes deployed when he knew he'd gone too far and needed to recalibrate. He was looking at her with mild inconvenience, like she had walked into a meeting she hadn't been invited to, and he was deciding the most efficient way to handle the interruption. "Olivia, He said her name the way he said difficult line items in a budget report. Flat, factual. I should have texted you. Her name is Vanessa Blake. She's staying in the guest room for a few days. There are some issues with her apartment. Vanessa turned to look at Olivia with the expression of someone who had prepared for this moment and was executing the preparation calmly. She didn't look apologetic. She looked patient. "Hi," Vanessa said. One word, as if they were being introduced at a party. Olivia stood in her own doorway and felt something very strange happening inside her chest. She had braced herself, or some part of her had the part that had known without ever fully acknowledging it, that something like this was possible. She had braced herself for heartbreak, for the collapse, for the specific devastating grief of betrayal. But what she felt was not grief. It was recognition. She recognized this moment, not because she had lived it before, but because she had quietly known it was coming for a long time and had spent years teaching herself not to look at it directly. "She's wearing my grandmother's bracelet," Olivia said. Her voice was calm. She was almost surprised by how calm it was. Daniel glanced at Vanessa's wrist. For one brief second, something flickered across his face. Then it was gone. "She found it on the dresser. I told her she could try it on. It was in the velvet box in the back of my closet." Silence. "Olivia." He set down his drink. He straightened slightly, and she recognized the posture. It was the one he used when he was about to reframe a conversation in his favor. "I understand this is a surprise, but I need you to be reasonable. Vanessa is going through a difficult time and she needed somewhere to stay temporarily. This is not what you're making it into." Olivia looked at him. She looked at Vanessa. She looked at the bracelet catching the light from the fireplace, and she heard her grandmother's voice from a memory that was 17 years old. "The ones who ask you to be reasonable when you have every right to fall apart are the ones who need your pain to stay small so they can stay comfortable." "Take it off," Olivia said to Vanessa. Vanessa looked at Daniel. That look, that particular look, that reflexive check, that instinctive deference, the immediate eye contact that said, "I need your guidance right now," told Olivia everything she needed to know about how long this had been happening and how thoroughly she had been kept in the dark. "Olivia, let's not make this into a scene," Daniel said. "Take the bracelet off. It belonged to my grandmother. It is not negotiable." Vanessa removed it slowly and set it on the mantel. She had the grace not to say anything further. Olivia walked across the room, picked up the bracelet, and held it in her palm. It was warm from Vanessa's skin. Something about that, the warmth, was the worst part. The evidence of how long it had been sitting there, on someone else's body, in Olivia's home. "How long?" Olivia asked. Daniel exhaled through his nose. "This isn't the conversation I want to have tonight." "How long?" "Olivia, answer me." The word came out quiet, but it cut. She watched him hear it, watched him calculate. "We can talk about the details when Vanessa isn't in the room." "Then ask Vanessa to leave the room. She's a guest." The word landed between them like a stone. A guest, in Olivia's home, with Olivia's bracelet. While Daniel's wife stood in the doorway, she had walked through 10,000 times and was apparently the person who needed to adjust her expectations. "I want to know something," Olivia said slowly. "Did you bring her here because you wanted me to know, or did you bring her here because you genuinely believed I would be fine with it?" Daniel opened his mouth, closed it. Then something shifted in his expression, something that looked almost like contempt dressed up as patience, and he said, "I brought her here because she needed somewhere to be, and I thought you were mature enough to handle it without turning it into a production." Olivia stood very still. She processed those words with the careful precision of a woman disassembling a clock to understand why it stopped. Mature enough, handle it, without turning it into a production. She thought about the 14 months she had run herself thin, keeping his charity foundation operational, when his board nearly collapsed. She thought about the night she had driven 3 hours to his mother's care facility alone because Daniel had a conference call and someone had to be there when his mother received the diagnosis. She thought about the business partner's wife who had cornered Olivia at a holiday party and whispered things about Daniel that Olivia had spent 6 months telling herself were jealousy and spite. She thought about every decision she had ever made with his reputation at the center of the calculation and her own needs somewhere at the outer edge where they wouldn't inconvenience anyone. And she understood something finally and completely that she had been circling for years without letting herself land on it. Daniel did not see her as a partner. He saw her as a function. A very efficient, very reliable, very graceful function that managed his household, protected his image, attended his events, and had always been expected to absorb whatever he needed to deposit and ask nothing difficult in return. He hadn't brought Vanessa here to be cruel. He had brought Vanessa here because he genuinely believed Olivia would handle it, because Olivia always handled it, because Olivia had spent 12 years teaching him that she would. "Don't make this dramatic," he said, and his voice was back in the register he used with employees who were escalating unnecessarily. "We are adults. Handle this with dignity." Olivia looked at him one more time. She looked at the man she had married, the man she had defended and supported and loved and protected, the man she had given her grandmother's bracelet proximity to without ever once considering that he might not guard it the way she did. She looked at him, and she waited for the heartbreak to hit the earthquake grief she had always assumed this moment would bring. But there was no earthquake. There was just the quiet, terrible clarity of a woman who finally understood the exact shape of her own life. She walked upstairs. She did not slam doors. She did not cry loud enough for anyone to hear. She moved through the bedrooms she had shared with Daniel Whitmore for 11 of their 12 years of marriage, and she opened the closet, and she took the emergency bag she had packed 2 months ago, not because she had planned to leave, but because something in her subconscious had known in the way that bodies know things, before minds are ready to, that the ground she was standing on was not solid, and she set it on the bed, and she added a few more items with methodical efficiency. The bracelet went into the inside pocket, her passport, her personal laptop, the folder with her documents that Margaret Collins had helped her organize. 3 months ago, when Olivia had gone to Margaret's office for what she told herself was just coffee and conversation, Margaret had looked at her with the quiet precision of a woman who had seen this exact situation many times and said, "You don't have to have a plan, but having a folder never hurt anyone." So Olivia had a folder. She came back downstairs with the bag on her shoulder. Vanessa had disappeared, probably to the kitchen or to the guest room. She apparently knew the location of, and Daniel was still standing near the fireplace with his drink. He saw the bag. Something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt. Not yet. Something more like the recalibration a person does when a situation turns out to be slightly less predictable than they assumed. "You're being dramatic," he said. "I'm leaving," she said. "Olivia, it's raining." "I know. You don't have anywhere to go at this hour. That's not your concern anymore." He set down the drink. His voice shifted lower, more controlled, more careful. This was the voice he used in negotiations when the other party had done something he didn't anticipate, and he needed to recover quickly. "Let's talk about this tomorrow when you're not emotional." "I'm not emotional," she said. "I'm done." "You're not done. You're upset. There's a difference." "Daniel." She said his name the way she had said it on the morning they got married, clearly and with full attention, the way you say something you mean to remember. "I've been upset before. I was upset when you missed Sophie's recital. I was upset when your partner's wife told me things at the Reed Foundation event that I chose not to believe. I was upset 100 times. This is different." "It's not different. I'm done protecting you." The words fell between them like something dropped from a height. He stared at her. "What does that even mean?" "It means I'm not going to be the person who keeps your reputation intact at the cost of my own dignity. It means whoever Vanessa is and however long she's been in our lives, I'm not going to smile at the next gala and pretend I don't know. It means I'm leaving this house tonight, and I'm not coming back to be the version of your wife that you need me to be." He almost laughed. She could see him almost doing it, the slight movement in his jaw, the reflex he nearly gave into. "You'll be back before midnight," he said. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was something worse. It was certainty. 12 years of Olivia's reliability had produced in Daniel Whitmore the unshakable belief that she would always return. That whatever she said in the heat of the moment, whatever line she drew, whatever door she appeared to be walking toward, she would stop before she crossed the threshold, because she always had, because she was Olivia, because Olivia endured. She picked up her bag. She walked to the front door. She opened it, and the night air hit her with the cold damp of a Chicago April rain, and she stepped out onto the front step and felt the first drops land on her jacket. She did not look back. Not because she wasn't feeling anything. She was feeling everything, every layer of grief, every year she had given to this marriage. Every morning she had woken up beside this man and chosen him again, and the weight of all of it was tremendous, pressing against the inside of her chest, like water behind a dam. But she did not turn around because she understood with the clarity that only comes when you have finally stopped lying to yourself that if she turned around, she would stay. And if she stayed, she would forgive him. And if she forgave him, she would spend the next 12 years making her pain invisible again. And she was so tired of being invisible. The car service number was already dialed by the time she reached the end of the driveway. Behind her, she heard the front door open. "Olivia," Daniel's voice in the rain, still controlled, still certain. "This is ridiculous. Come inside." She gave the dispatcher Margaret Collins's address on the north side. "Olivia." The car arrived in 4 minutes. She got in. She watched the house disappear in the rear window. And for the first time in 12 years, Olivia Carter sat in the back seat of a car and let herself feel exactly what she felt, without managing it, without containing it, without making it convenient for anyone else. The grief came, of course it came. It had been waiting, and she let it come. She let the tears fall and the hands shake and the breath come in uneven pulls, and she thought about her grandmother's bracelet pressed against her palm and the warmth that had been on it that was not hers, and she cried all the way to the north side. When the car stopped, the door to Margaret Collins's row house opened before Olivia could knock. Margaret was 71 years old. She had been an attorney for 45 years, a widow for 7, and the fiercest woman Olivia had ever known. She had also been her mother's best friend, and the person who had sat with Olivia in a hospital corridor 14 years ago before the wedding, when Olivia's mother had her first stroke, and held her hand without saying anything, because Margaret understood that some moments do not need language. She took one look at Olivia standing in the rain with a go-bag on her shoulder and said nothing at all. She simply stepped back and held the door open. Olivia walked inside. Margaret closed the door behind her and went to make tea. Not because tea solved anything, but because having something warm to hold while you are trying to stop shaking is better than nothing. Olivia sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she and her mother had sat 100 times, and she put the bracelet on the table in front of her, and she looked at it. "He let her wear it," she said. Margaret set the kettle on. "Tell me everything." So Olivia told her. Everything she said was measured at first, organized the way Olivia always organized things. But somewhere in the middle of describing the way Vanessa had looked at Daniel for permission before removing the bracelet, something unlocked, and the story stopped being measured and became what it actually was, the account of a woman who had spent more than a decade disappearing into someone else's life and had just finally walked toward the door. Margaret listened without interrupting. This was a skill Olivia had always admired in her, the ability to be fully present without filling the space. When Olivia finished, Margaret wrapped both hands around her own mug and was quiet for a moment. "You're not going back," Margaret said. It was not a question. "No." "Then we start tonight." "It's almost 10 o'clock. "So it is," Margaret said. "I've filed injunctions at worse hours." She got up and went to the desk in the corner of the kitchen, where she kept a legal pad and a pen that she'd had for 15 years. "Tell me about the foundation accounts. Tell me about the property. Tell me what you know about his business partners." And that was how it began. Not with tears, though, there were plenty of those. Not with anger, though there was plenty of that, too. It began with a 71-year-old woman in a kitchen in the north side of Chicago, writing things down on a yellow legal pad at 10 o'clock at night, because the woman sitting across from her had finally decided that her life was worth fighting for. Olivia talked for 2 hours. Margaret wrote everything down. At midnight, Olivia's phone lit up on the table. "Daniel." She watched the screen without moving. "Do you want to answer it?" Margaret asked. "No," Olivia said. She watched the screen go dark. It lit up again, and then one final time, and then there was a text message. She turned the phone over so she couldn't see the screen. "He thinks I'll be back by morning," she said. Margaret made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "Men like Daniel always do," she said. "It's because they've confused patience with surrender." Olivia picked up the bracelet and turned it over in her hands. "My grandmother would have known what to do," she said. "Your grandmother did the same thing you just did," Margaret said quietly. "She walked out of a marriage that was eating her alive, and she built something better. She just never talked about it much." Olivia looked up. "She never told me that." "She told me." Margaret looked at her steadily. "Eleanor was the bravest woman I knew, and you are her granddaughter." Something in Olivia's chest shifted, not the grief that was still there, enormous and real, but underneath it something else, something smaller, harder, and very much alive. "What do I need to do first?" she asked. "First," Margaret said, "you sleep. And tomorrow morning you call your accountant and your attorney, and then we figure out what's yours." Olivia nodded. She slept in her mother's old room in a bed that smelled of lavender, with the bracelet on the nightstand, and 12 years of her life somewhere on the other side of the city. And across town, Daniel Whitmore stood in the house on Ashburn Lane, drink in hand, waiting for the sound of a car in the driveway. He waited until 2 in the morning. He called 6 times. He sent 4 texts. He stood at the window and watched the rain come down and told himself what he always told himself when reality arrived at a shape he hadn't ordered, that this would resolve, that Olivia would process her feelings and understand, that she was too reasonable, too careful, too deeply invested in the life they had built to truly walk away from it. He believed this completely. He had no idea that across the city, a 71-year-old attorney was already writing down the names of accounts. He had no idea that the woman he had told to handle it with dignity had been for 2 months quietly doing exactly that, handling it, just not in the direction he assumed. And he had no idea that the next time he would see Olivia Carter would not be at his breakfast table. It would be at the gala. And by then, everything would be different. Margaret Collins did not sleep that night. Olivia knew this because at 3 in the morning, when she gave up on sleep entirely and came downstairs in borrowed pajamas with her grandmother's bracelet still in her fist, Margaret was at the kitchen table with her reading glasses on and the yellow legal pad half full of notes. A second mug of tea sat across from Olivia's chair like it had been waiting for her. "Sit," Margaret said without looking up. Olivia sat. "I've been thinking about the foundation accounts," Margaret said. "Specifically the Donor Relations Committee. You've been co-chair for how long? 7 years. And Daniel's name is on the letterhead as founder, but the operational relationships, the donors, the vendors, the event contracts, those run through you." "Always through me," Olivia said. "Daniel liked the title. He didn't like the meetings." Margaret wrote something down. "Good. That matters more than he knows." Olivia wrapped both hands around the mug. Outside the kitchen window, the rain had stopped, but the street was still dark and wet and very quiet. She thought about Daniel standing at the window in Ashburn Lane. She thought about whether he was still waiting or whether he had gone to bed. She thought about Vanessa Blake sleeping in the guest room of Olivia's house, and the thought produced in her something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, something harder and colder, something she did not yet have a name for. "He's going to call people," Olivia said. "In the morning. He's going to start working the narrative before I have a chance to say anything." "Yes," Margaret said simply. "He will. He'll tell them I overreacted, that I misunderstood the situation, that Vanessa is a colleague and I embarrassed everyone by leaving. That is exactly what he'll do." Margaret set down her pen and looked at Olivia directly. "Which is why you won't be responding to the narrative. You'll be building a different one entirely." Olivia looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means you stop thinking like Daniel's wife and start thinking like Eleanor Carter's granddaughter." Margaret tapped the legal pad. "Eleanor built the Carter Foundation from nothing. Your family name carries weight in this city that has nothing to do with Daniel Whitmore. He borrowed that weight. You're going to take it back." The words landed somewhere deep in a place Olivia hadn't accessed in years. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I don't want to destroy him." "I know you don't." Margaret picked up her pen again. "That's what makes you better at this than he is." By morning, Daniel had called 9 times. Olivia knew because her phone screen logged every attempt. She hadn't answered any of them. She'd sat with the phone in her hand and watched his name appear and disappear and appear again, and each time she felt the pull, the reflex that 12 years had carved into her, the automatic response that said, "Answer it, smooth it over, be the reasonable one," and each time she put the phone face down on the table and let the call run out. At 7:45, a text came through that was different from the others. It read, "I've spoken to our attorney. You should know where you stand before you do something irreversible." Olivia read it twice. Then she showed it to Margaret. Margaret read it, set the phone down, and said, "Good. Now I know what kind of game he's playing." She was already dialing her own phone before the sentence was finished. What Daniel did not know, what he had no reason to know because Olivia had handled it quietly and without announcement, was that 3 months ago, before the night that changed everything, before Vanessa Blake and the bracelet and the 2 words that ended a marriage, Olivia had sat in a different attorney's office. Not Margaret's. A divorce specialist named Claire Novak, who worked out of a firm on Michigan Avenue, and who had reviewed Olivia's marriage assets with the careful precision of a surgeon, identifying exactly which structures were load-bearing and which were not. That conversation had begun, as many of Olivia's most important conversations did, as something she told herself was just information gathering. She wasn't planning to leave, she just wanted to understand. But understanding turned out to be the first step. And by the time she had walked out of Claire Novak's office with a folder of documents she carried to Margaret's house and stored in a file cabinet in the guest room, she understood the landscape of her own marriage with a clarity that Daniel had never considered she might possess. She knew which accounts had her name. She knew which properties were jointly held and which were not. She knew that the charitable foundation, despite Daniel's name on the letterhead, was legally structured in a way that gave the board not Daniel personally authority over its operations. And she knew that her 7 years as co-chair of donor relations had produced something Daniel had always taken for granted: relationships, real ones. The kind built on mutual respect and shared purpose, and years of showing up that had nothing to do with Daniel Whitmore's name or Daniel Whitmore's money. Those relationships were Olivia's, and Daniel, who measured the value of everything in terms of what it had cost him financially, had never once considered that the most valuable things in their marriage were the ones he hadn't paid for. At 9 in the morning, Olivia called Renata Voss. Renata was 63 years old, Hungarian-born, Chicago-raised, and one of the most significant philanthropic donors in the Midwest. She had been contributing to the Carter Foundation for 11 years. She had first met Olivia at a hospital gala, and within 15 minutes had decided she was the most sensible woman in the room. They had lunch 4 times a year at a restaurant on the Gold Coast and talked about books and their mothers, and occasionally about the specific exhaustion of being a woman who was very good at what she did in a world that kept trying to give the credit to the men nearby. Renata picked up on the second ring. "Olivia." Her voice was warm and immediate. "I've been thinking about you. Renata, I need to tell you something, directly because I think you deserve directness." A brief silence. Then, "Go ahead." "I've left Daniel, permanently. I don't have the full story organized yet, but I didn't want you to hear something from his side first and wonder why I hadn't called." Another silence, longer this time. Then Renata said quietly, but with absolute precision, "How long has it been going on?" Olivia closed her eyes. "I don't know exactly. But you know it wasn't recent." "Yes. The girl at the November event," Renata said. It wasn't a question. Something cold moved through Olivia. "What do you mean?" "There was a woman at the November donor dinner. She came with Daniel. He introduced her as a colleague from the development side of his firm. I remember thinking at the time that she looked at him the way women look at men they know very well." A pause. "I didn't say anything because I didn't know what I knew, but I've thought about it since." Olivia sat down. The November dinner had been 6 months ago. She had been there. She had stood at that event in a black dress and hosted a table of 12 and made sure every donor felt seen and appreciated and eager to contribute again. And Daniel had circulated through the room with a woman he introduced as a colleague, and Olivia had been so busy being the fulcrum of the entire event that she had barely registered the introduction. 6 months, maybe longer. "Olivia," Renata said gently, "what do you need?" "I need the board to know the truth before Daniel's version reaches them. Consider it handled." No hesitation. None. "I'm calling Patricia Haynes today and Gerald Webb. Between the 3 of us, we cover the majority of the board's significant donor relationships. Daniel Whitmore does not get to rewrite this story." Olivia exhaled slowly. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just keep doing what you've always done. Build something worth standing in front of." A beat. "And Olivia, call me when you're ready to talk about the next chapter. I have some ideas." After she hung up, Olivia sat for a long time without moving. She had expected this to be harder. She had expected to have to persuade people to fight for credibility, to prove herself against the version of events Daniel was already constructing. She had dreaded these phone calls for weeks in the abstract imaginary version of this day that she'd turned over in her mind without ever letting herself admit that was what she was doing. But what she was discovering call by call and conversation by conversation was something she hadn't fully anticipated. People already knew, not everything, not the details, but the people who had worked closely with Olivia over the years, the people who had seen her run events, manage crises, keep the foundation operational during difficult periods, show up every time she said she would show up, those people had their own accounting. And in their accounting, Olivia Carter's credibility did not depend on Daniel Whitmore's endorsement. She had built that herself. Over 12 years, while she was busy making herself invisible, she had also been making herself indispensable. And Daniel had never noticed because he had never been paying attention to that particular ledger. 3 days after Olivia walked out of the house on Ashburn Lane, the call came that she hadn't expected. She was at the kitchen table with a second legal pad of her own, now reviewing the foundation's financial documentation that Margaret had requested from the board's administrative office. The numbers had been bothering her. Small things at first, discrepancies in event expense reports, vendor contracts that didn't match the invoices she remembered, approving a donor grant that appeared to have been redirected through a subsidiary she didn't recognize. She had been staring at one particular line item for 20 minutes when her phone rang with a number she didn't have saved. She almost let it go to voicemail. She was exhausted, and she had 3 more calls scheduled before noon, and the numbers in front of her were beginning to produce in her a deep, slow-rolling dread that she wasn't ready to fully examine yet. But something made her answer. Olivia Carter. The voice was male-measured, professionally warm. My name is Ethan Reed. I'm not sure if you remember me. We've crossed paths a few times at charitable events over the past few years. I run a nonprofit called the Forward Path Initiative. She did remember him, actually. More clearly than he might have expected. Ethan Reed was the kind of person you remembered because he was so completely uninterested in being the most important person in the room. She had met him twice, once at a hospital benefit and once at a panel discussion on philanthropic sustainability, and both times had come away from the conversation feeling like she'd spoken with someone who actually listened, which was rarer than it should have been. I remember you, she said. The Forward Path Initiative, Women's Economic Recovery and Housing. A slight pause, and she could hear the surprise in it. That's right. I'm glad you... He stopped, recalibrated. I'm going to be straightforward with you if that's all right. I've heard that you're going through a significant life transition. I heard it from Renata Voss, who suggested I call. I'm not reaching out to insert myself into a difficult situation. I'm calling because we have a board position opening in the spring, and I've wanted to speak with you about it for over a year, and Renata suggested now might not be the worst time for you to hear about professional opportunities. Olivia almost smiled. Renata working this quickly was almost impressive. What kind of board position? Advisory, primarily focused on donor strategy and community partnerships. Your background with the Carter Foundation. The work you've actually done. Not the letterhead is exactly what we've been looking for. A brief pause. I know the timing is not ideal. The timing is exactly what it is, Olivia said. Tell me more about the initiative, he told her. And what struck her as he spoke was not the details of the program, though those were impressive, but the way he spoke about the women the initiative served, not as cases or demographics or beneficiaries, as people navigating genuinely hard terrain who deserved the same quality of resources and support that any person deserved, regardless of where they were starting from. It reminded her of why she had gotten involved with charitable work in the first place before it became something Daniel attended for its networking value. Can I ask you something? She said when he had finished. Of course. Why did you wait a year to reach out? You said you'd wanted to. A moment of quiet. Then he said honestly, because you were married to Daniel Whitmore, and every conversation I imagined having with you about the work would have ended up being about him eventually. I wasn't interested in that dynamic. I wanted to talk to you, not to the wife of. Olivia held the phone and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Seen. Not performed for, not managed, not evaluated for her usefulness to someone else's agenda, just seen. I'll have coffee with you, she said. This week if you're available. Thursday. When she hung up, Margaret was standing in the doorway with the expression of a woman who had heard enough to understand everything. Renata moves fast, she said. She always has. Olivia set the phone down and looked back at the financial documents. Margaret. Come look at this. Margaret came to the table and bent over the papers. For a moment she was quiet. Then she said, Where did this vendor come from? I don't know. I've never seen it. But the invoice is signed off with Daniel's approval code and the amount is substantial. Substantial enough to matter. Substantial enough to constitute a significant portion of the event budget that was supposedly spent on venue coordination. Olivia pointed to a line further down. And here, this grant disbursement. The recipient organization, I've never heard of it. But the address in the filing puts it in the same building as one of Daniel's private investment vehicles. Margaret straightened up slowly. She took off her reading glasses. She set them on the table with the particular deliberateness of a woman who needs a moment to organize very significant thoughts. Olivia, she said, I know. This isn't just about the affair. I know. This is financial misconduct, potentially fraud. I know. Olivia's voice was steady, but her hands were not. She pressed them flat on the table. I need to know how much, and I need to know for how long, and I need to know if I signed anything, if my name is on anything that could be interpreted as my knowing about it. Margaret was already picking up her phone. I'm calling Claire Novak, and then I'm calling someone else. Who? Someone who handles this kind of situation very well, and who owes me a significant favor from 2019. She was already dialing. Make more tea. This is going to be a long morning. It was not just a long morning. It was the beginning of a long, methodical unraveling that took weeks and produced in Olivia something she had not expected. Not rage, though. There was plenty of that in the quiet hours of the night when she lay awake in her mother's old bedroom and stared at the ceiling. Not even grief, though, that came and went in waves that could knock her sideways without warning. What the unraveling produced was understanding. Understanding of the scale of what Daniel had been doing. Understanding that the man she had protected for 12 years had been during the same 12 years using the machinery she helped build to serve himself in ways she had never been permitted to see. The Foundation's reputation, which was in large measure Olivia's reputation, had opened doors for Daniel that he had walked through without her. Donor relationships she had cultivated had been leveraged to produce introductions she'd never known about. Charitable events she had organized down to the last detail had served on at least 3 documented occasions as cover for business conversations that had nothing to do with charity. He had used her, not the way a man uses a woman he resents, worse than that, the way a man uses a resource he has come to take completely for granted, whose value he has never examined because it has always simply been available. The week after the call with Ethan Reed, Olivia met him for coffee at a small restaurant on the north side not far from Margaret's house. She had expected to feel the way she always felt at professional meetings, calibrated, slightly guarded alert to the ways the conversation might be steered towards someone else's agenda. She did not feel that way. Ethan Reed was in person exactly what he had sounded like on the phone. He was 51, trim, unhurried, in the way that genuinely confident people are unhurried. He asked her questions and listened to the actual answers. He disagreed with something she said about donor retention strategy clearly and without apology, and then explained his reasoning with enough specificity that she could engage with it rather than just absorb it. She disagreed back. He responded with what looked like genuine interest. At no point did he mention Daniel. At no point did she feel like a supporting character in a story about someone else. When the coffee was finished and they were putting on their coats, he said, I want to be transparent with you about something. Renata Voss did suggest I call, but everything I said about the board position is real and independent of that. I'm not reaching out because I think you need to be rescued. I'm reaching out because you're one of the most effective people in this sector, and you've been significantly underutilized, and that's a waste of talent that bothers me professionally. He paused. I realize that might sound clinical. It sounds honest, Olivia said. I've been getting a lot of careful lately. Honest is better. He nodded. Thursday week I have a program review meeting. Would you want to sit in no commitment, just to see the work? Yes, she said, without hesitating. Walking back to Margaret's car, Olivia thought about something her grandmother had said once a long time ago about what it felt like to start over. It doesn't feel like starting, Eleanor had said. It feels like waking up after sleeping too long. Your legs are stiff and the light is disorienting. But you're awake, and that's the part that matters. Back on Ashburn Lane, Daniel Whitmore was not sleeping well. The first week, he had managed the situation, the way he managed every situation, by controlling the information flow. He had spoken to his attorney, who had said what attorneys say in the early stages of these things. He had spoken to his business partner, Raymond Cho, who had listened carefully and then asked 2 questions that Daniel was not prepared for. He had called his mother's care coordinator, who had no opinion about the matter, but who was the only person he'd called who had simply listened without assessing him. By the end of the 2nd week, he had begun to understand that the ground was shifting in ways he hadn't anticipated. The first indication came from Raymond, who mentioned almost casually that Patricia Haynes had called him to discuss the foundation board. Raymond described the conversation with a measured flatness that told Daniel everything about its actual content. Patricia Haynes was one of the foundation's most significant donors. She had known Olivia for 9 years. She had apparently some questions about the direction of the foundation's financial management. "What kind of questions?" Daniel asked. Raymond looked at him for a moment before he answered. "The specific kind," he said. The second indication came when Daniel's event coordinator, a woman named Leslie, who had worked with the foundation for 4 years and whose primary relationship had always been with Olivia, sent a professionally worded email saying she would be stepping back from the spring gala planning pending clarification of her professional relationship with the foundation going forward. She hoped Daniel understood. He did not understand. He called her. She did not pick up. The third indication was the most significant, and it came from a direction Daniel had not been watching. The board had requested a formal financial review. Not unusual on its own, they conducted them annually. But this one was not the annual review. This one was a special session requested by 3 board members, including Renata Voss, and it was scheduled to take place 6 weeks before the spring gala. Daniel's attorney received the notice. Daniel read it 3 times. Then he called Vanessa, who was still staying in the guest room, even though her apartment had been apparently fine for at least 2 weeks. "She's doing something," he said. Vanessa looked at him with an expression that was careful and not quite what he needed from her. "Daniel, Olivia, she's doing something. This isn't just her being emotional." "I know," Vanessa said. "What do you mean you know?" A pause. "I mean, I know, Olivia, and I know this isn't someone falling apart. This is someone who has been thinking for a long time." Daniel stared at her. "How do you know anything about what Olivia does or doesn't do?" Vanessa looked away. "I've been watching her work for 2 years, Daniel. She runs circles around everyone in that room, and none of you see it because she makes it look effortless." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the house. "You admire her," Daniel said slowly. Vanessa didn't answer, which was itself an answer. Daniel walked away from that conversation and stood in the kitchen for a long time, looking at the counter where Olivia used to leave her keys and her notebook, and the small worn copy of her calendar that she had kept by hand since before they were married. The counter was bare. It had been bare for 2 weeks, and it had taken him until this exact moment to notice that the bareness was not just absence. It was evidence of how much space she had occupied, of how much he had structured his life around her presence without ever once acknowledging that he was doing it. He thought about what she had said on the night she left, not the part about Vanessa, not the part about the bracelet, the other part, "I'm done protecting you." I thought about what that meant. He had spent 2 weeks telling himself it was an emotional statement, a dramatic exit line, the kind of thing people said in the heat of the moment. He had told himself she would come to her senses when the initial anger passed. But now looking at this bare counter and the notice of financial review and thinking about Leslie, the event coordinator, who wouldn't pick up the phone, he was beginning to understand something he had resisted for 2 weeks with every resource at his disposal. Olivia had not been angry when she left. She had been finished. And there is a difference between a woman who is angry and a woman who is finished, that Daniel Whitmore was only now standing in an empty kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, beginning to genuinely comprehend. He picked up his phone and called the number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Olivia's voice on the voicemail message. Calm, clear, professional. He didn't leave a message. He had been so certain she would be back before midnight on the first night. He had said it to himself like a fact, like a certainty grounded in 12 years of precedent. He had gone to bed that first night with the calm of a man who understood how things worked and was confident in the pattern. But the pattern was gone. And in its place was a reckoning that was moving toward him with the quiet inevitability of something that had been building for a very long time and that he had been too comfortable to see coming. Across the city, Olivia sat with Ethan Reed's program review notes spread on Margaret's kitchen table, and she thought about the Forward Path Initiative's housing model, and she thought about the house on Ashburn Lane, and she thought about all the women she had met over the years at charitable events. Women who had smiled and managed and endured and handled things with dignity until the moment they couldn't anymore. She thought about what it would mean to give them somewhere to go. Not just a shelter, not just a transitional space, something that felt like a beginning instead of an emergency. She wrote 3 pages of notes. She fell asleep at the kitchen table for the second time that week. Margaret found her there in the morning, covered her with the throw blanket from the couch, and let her sleep. Outside Chicago was moving through April toward May, and somewhere in the future that neither of them could see, yet a ballroom was waiting, and a gala was coming. And Daniel Whitmore, for all his certainty and all his control and all his years of believing that Olivia would always be where he needed her to be, had no idea what was already in motion. The invitation arrived at Margaret's house on a Tuesday morning, slipped through the mail slot with the ordinary indifference of something that had no idea what it was carrying. Olivia picked it up from the floor, turned it over, and read the embossed lettering on the envelope without moving for a full 10 seconds. The Carter Foundation Annual Spring Gala, Saturday the 14th, black tie, the Grand Ballroom at the Meridian Hotel. Her name was still on the mailing list. Of course it was. Nobody had thought to remove it. Or maybe someone had, and this was Daniel's way of making sure she knew the event was happening, a quiet provocation dressed up as administrative oversight. Either way, it was in her hands now, and it meant something that she hadn't expected to feel this sharply. The gala was her event. It had been her event for 7 consecutive years. She had chosen every vendor negotiated, every contract selected the centerpieces and the menu and the program order and the seating arrangements that required the diplomatic precision of a foreign policy negotiation. She had written the remarks that Daniel delivered from the podium every year while she stood near the back of the room and made sure the AV was working and the right donors were at the right tables and nothing fell apart before the big ask. She had built it. And now it was 3 weeks away, and she was standing in Margaret's hallway holding an invitation to the thing she had built as though she were a guest. "Margaret," she called. Margaret appeared from the kitchen, looked at the envelope, looked at Olivia's face. "Well," she said, "I'm going. I know you are. I need you to call Claire Novak today. I need to know exactly where we stand on the asset restructuring documents." "Already on my list." Margaret took the envelope, examined it. "Have you spoken to Ethan about this?" Olivia had. Not in detail. They had met 3 times since the coffee on the North Side, twice for the program review at Forward Path, and once for a dinner that had started as professional and ended as something she didn't yet have an easy word for. Ethan Reed was not a man who moved fast or spoke carelessly or tried to fill silence with himself. He was the kind of person who asked a question and then waded through your entire answer before forming his response. Olivia had not realized how rare that was until she sat across from it. She had told him about the gala obliquely on the second meeting, describing the foundation work in terms of what it had been and what it was now becoming. He had listened and then said simply, "Are you going to be there when it happens?" "When what happens?" she had asked. "Whatever you're building toward," he said. "I've watched enough of these situations to know when someone is building toward something, and you are." She had not answered him directly that day. But she was answering him now, 3 weeks out, standing in Margaret's hallway with the invitation in her hand. She called him that afternoon. "The gala is in 3 weeks," she said when he picked up. A pause, not long. "I know. I received an invitation as well. Forward Path has been a minor donor to the foundation for the past 2 years. I'm going," she said, "and I'd like to go with you, if you're willing to understand what that means in that room on that night." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Not the uncertain quiet of someone who didn't know what to say, the deliberate quiet of someone who was thinking clearly. "I understand exactly what it means," he said. "Are you sure?" "I've been sure about very few things this year," Olivia said. "I'm sure about this." "Then I'll be there," he said. "Whatever you need that night." What she needed, it turned out, was more complicated than she had anticipated. Because in the 2 weeks before the gala, things moved faster than anyone had expected, including Margaret, which was saying something because Margaret had been doing this for 45 years, and she was not a woman who was easily surprised by human behavior. The board's special financial review had taken place quietly and without fanfare on a Thursday afternoon in a conference room at the Foundation's administrative offices. Olivia had not attended. She was not currently a board member, and Claire Novak had advised her to stay entirely clear of the proceedings and let the documentation speak for itself. So Olivia had sat at Margaret's kitchen table and had been unable to eat anything, and had pretended to read a book while actually reading the same paragraph 17 times. Margaret had been in contact with Gerald Webb, who was on the review panel and who had known Margaret since law school, and trusted her with the kind of professional candor that existed only between people who had been in difficult situations together. At 4:30, Margaret's phone rang. She took it to the other room. Olivia listened to the muffled rhythm of the conversation, Margaret's voice measured and careful, and Gerald's on the other end, and tried to read something meaningful into the pauses. When Margaret came back, she sat down across from Olivia and folded her hands on the table. "The review found what we found," she said, "and then some." Olivia set down the book she hadn't been reading. "How much more?" Enough that the board voted at the close of the session to formally separate Daniel Whitmore from the Foundation's operational oversight, pending a complete audit. She paused. "Effective immediately." The words took a moment to reach Olivia's full understanding. "He's been removed from the Foundation." "Temporarily in legal terms. Practically, yes." Margaret's voice was even. "They also voted to retain you, specifically you, in your capacity as former co-chair of donor relations, as an advisory consultant, to ensure continuity through the gala." Olivia looked at her. "They voted to bring me in, unanimously." She sat with that for a long time. Outside, a car passed. Somewhere in the house, a clock was ticking. The world continued its ordinary motion, while something extraordinary settled into the space between them. "He doesn't know yet," Olivia said. "Gerald said they would be contacting his attorney at 5 o'clock. He's going to think I engineered this." "You didn't engineer it," Margaret said. "The facts did. You simply didn't look away from them." "He won't see the difference." "No," Margaret agreed. "He won't. Men who have never been accountable rarely understand the difference between consequences and attacks." She paused. "Are you all right?" Olivia thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet," she said. "Ask me after the gala." What happened next was something Olivia had not planned for, which was that Daniel called her. Not through his attorney, not through a mutual acquaintance. He called her directly from his personal number at 6:47 in the evening, 2 hours after his attorney received the board's notification. She almost didn't pick up. She had been not picking up his calls for nearly 6 weeks, but something in the timing told her this call was different from the others, and she made a decision in the space of 2 rings that she would answer it, and she would listen because she was not afraid of him, and because part of what made her different from who she used to be was that she no longer managed situations by avoiding them. She picked up. "You did this," he said. No greeting. Just those 3 words, and beneath them a fury she recognized immediately. The specific, pressurized anger of a man who has been powerful for a very long time and has just encountered the limits of that power for the first time. "Hello, Daniel." Don't do the calm thing with me right now." His voice was tight, controlled but barely. "You fed information to the board. You've been working against me for weeks." "I shared documents with attorneys," she said. "The attorneys shared relevant findings with the appropriate oversight body. That's how it works. You had no right. I had every right. My name was on the Foundation's co-chair documentation for 7 years. My relationships with the donors were used to build the credibility that made the financial irregularities possible. I had not only the right, but the obligation." Silence. She could hear him breathing. "I never touched your foundation," he said, and his voice had shifted lower, tighter, something close to dangerous. "Everything I did was through legitimate business structures." "The audit will determine that," Olivia said. "That's what audits are for." "Olivia." His voice changed again, became the voice she remembered from the earlier years, the one that had felt like strength, and turned out to be just another form of pressure. "This has gone far enough. We need to sit down and talk about this before it becomes something neither of us can control." "I think you mean something you can't control," she said. "I'm doing fine." A long pause. When he spoke again, his voice was different from anything she recognized. Not the business register, not the charming register, not even the controlled anger, something rawer and less strategic. "Do you hate me?" The question surprised her enough that she didn't answer immediately. "Because I need to know," he said. "I need to know if this is about punishment." "It's not about punishment, Daniel." She meant it, and something in the honesty of it made her voice soften slightly, though not back down. It's about the fact that you used something I built with my family's name and my grandmother's connections, and 7 years of my time to serve your interests without telling me. And I found out. And the people who needed to know found out too." She paused. "That's not punishment. That's just reality catching up." He didn't respond. "I'm going to be at the gala," she said. More silence. Then, "Of course you are. I wanted you to know, not to prepare you, just because I think you deserve to know." She hung up. Margaret was standing in the doorway. She had heard enough. "How was that?" she asked. "Necessary," Olivia said. She set the phone down very carefully, like it was something that needed to be placed and not thrown. "I need tea, and I need to decide what I'm wearing on Saturday." In the 2 weeks that remained before the gala, Olivia worked. She threw herself into the Forward Path program review with a focus that Ethan commented on gently during one of their evening calls. "You're processing," he said. It wasn't a criticism. "Is it obvious? Only to someone paying attention." A pause. "What's the piece you keep turning over?" She thought about it. Whether I'm doing the right thing for the right reasons, or whether some part of this is about watching him lose something. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Here's what I know about you from 8 weeks of watching you work," he said. "You care about outcomes, real ones, the housing program, the donor continuity, the women who depend on the foundation's services. You've been focused on those outcomes consistently, even when the personal stakes were giving you every reason to be focused on yourself." A beat. The fact that Daniel's choices put him in the path of consequences doesn't make you responsible for engineering those consequences. It makes you someone who refused to look away. Olivia listened to that and let it settle. "I'm terrified of Saturday," she said. It was the most honest thing she had said out loud in 2 weeks. "I know," he said. "Not of Daniel. Of walking into a room that I built and having everyone look at me and decide what story they're telling themselves." "Some of them will tell the wrong story," he said. "You can't control that." "No. But you can walk in like someone who knows what she's worth. The rest takes care of itself." She had found the dress 3 days before the gala in the back of a boutique on the near north side that her mother had loved. Emerald green. Not chosen for any symbolic reason, she had simply stood in the dressing room and looked at herself in it, and felt for the first time in months like the person she recognized from before the invisibility had set in. The woman who had once walked into rooms and commanded them without meaning to. The woman Eleanor Carter had looked at and seen her own determination reflected back. She wore her grandmother's bracelet. Of course she did. The night of the gala. Ethan arrived at Margaret's house exactly on time. He knocked, not rang. He came inside and greeted Margaret with the manner of someone who understood completely what the older woman had been to Olivia through this period, and Margaret looked at him for approximately 4 seconds with the assessment of someone who had spent a professional lifetime reading people, and then said, "Don't be late getting her there. The Renata Voss table needs Olivia in the room before the cocktail hour ends." Ethan looked at Olivia. "Ready." Olivia picked up her bag, felt the weight of the bracelet on her wrist, thought about her grandmother, and about April Rain, and about a bare counter in a house on Ashburn Lane, and about every version of herself she had been on the way to becoming this one. "Ready," she said. The Meridian Hotel ballroom was already at 3/4 capacity when they arrived. Olivia felt the room before she entered it, the particular energy of a space full of people who knew each other well enough to be watching for exactly the kind of arrival they were about to witness. She paused for just a moment outside the ballroom doors. Ethan was beside her. He didn't say anything. He reached over, not to take her hand, not yet, just a brief, steady pressure at her elbow that said, "I'm here," and that was enough. She walked in. The room registered them in waves. She watched it happen the way attention moved through a crowd, starting with the people closest to the door, who turned and then turned back and then turned again, and the effect rippling outward until the far end of the room had stilled slightly, just enough, just for a second, before the pretense of normal conversation resumed at a slightly elevated volume. Renata Voss was at her table on the left side of the room. She met Olivia's eyes across the space and raised her glass with the small, precise satisfaction of a woman who had been right about something important. Patricia Haynes found Olivia within 5 minutes of her arrival. Patricia was 67, a former corporate attorney, and a woman who communicated primarily in precision. "You look extraordinary," she said. "The board is fully briefed. Gerald Webb is speaking with the auditor's representative before dinner. Everything is in place." She glanced at Ethan with unambiguous approval. "Ethan, Good to see you here. Patricia, he said warmly. She moved on. Olivia watched her go and felt the architecture of the evening clicking into place around her. And then she felt it before she saw it. The particular shift in the room's energy that happened when Daniel Whitmore walked in. She turned. He was across the ballroom near the entrance on the far side. He was in black tie, which he wore well. She had always admitted that, and beside him was not Vanessa. Beside him was Raymond Cho, his business partner, who looked like a man who had been briefed on an uncomfortable situation and was managing his own presence carefully. Daniel was scanning the room with the practiced ease of a man who had worked rooms like this for decades. And then he found her. The moment Daniel Whitmore saw Olivia Carter standing in the middle of the room, he had built his public identity around wearing emerald green and the bracelet that had belonged to Eleanor Carter, standing beside Ethan Reed, with the particular unhurried stillness of a woman who was exactly where she chose to be that moment, was visible from across the ballroom. His expression didn't collapse. Men like Daniel did not collapse in public. But something went out of him visibly and immediately like a light switch. He had been expecting her to come alone. He had been expecting to manage her presence here the way he managed everything to control the framing, to shape the narrative to be the gravitational center that other people oriented around. He had not been expecting Ethan Reed. Olivia watched him recalibrate, watched the professionalism come back over his face like a mask being carefully replaced. And then he began moving toward them through the crowd with the deliberate pace of a man who intended to address something directly. "Here he comes," Ethan said quietly, not alarmed, just factual. "I know," she said. Daniel covered the distance between them in 30 seconds. He moved with the confidence of a man on his own territory, and he had not yet fully processed that the territory had shifted under him. He stopped 3 feet in front of them and looked at Olivia. He did not look at Ethan. "I need to speak with you," he said. His voice was low and precisely controlled. "Then speak," she said. "Ethan is someone I trust. You can say what you need to say." A flicker of something in his eyes. "Privately." "No." The word was not loud. It was not aggressive. It simply landed definitive and unmovable in the space between them. Daniel's jaw tightened. He looked at Ethan for the first time. Whatever calculation he ran in that moment, he didn't like the result. "What exactly are you doing, Olivia?" "Attending the gala I spent 7 years building," she said. "The same thing I do every year." "You brought—" He stopped himself. "Reset. You understand what this looks like." "I know exactly what it looks like," she said. "That's why I'm here." Ethan did something then that Olivia had not asked him to do and did not need to ask. He reached down calmly and without theatrics and took her hand. Not a dramatic gesture, not a performance, just a man standing beside a woman and reaching for her hand the way people do when they are together, and the moment calls for it. Daniel saw it. The whole room that was pretending not to watch saw it. And something happened to Daniel's face that Olivia had never seen in 12 years of marriage. The control cracked, not completely, not in the way that produces scenes, not the kind of anger that escalated into something loud and ugly, but cracked nonetheless in the way that reveals what's underneath the management. What was underneath was not rage at Olivia. What was underneath was the shock of a man who understood finally and completely and too late that the woman he had been certain would always be where he needed her was standing in front of him, belonging entirely to herself. "You moved on," he said. The words came out stripped of calculation, just the raw fact of them. "Yes," she said, "I did." His voice found something close to anger again. "You did this to humiliate me, in this room, in front of these people." "No, Daniel, I did this because this is my life." She met his eyes with complete steadiness. "I came to this gala because I helped build it, and I am still part of this foundation's future. I brought Ethan because he is someone who respects the work and who is standing where he is because he wants to be, not because I needed an audience." She paused. "What you're feeling right now has nothing to do with me. It has to do with what you lost, and those are different things." His mouth pressed into a hard line. "We need to discuss the board's decision. This is not over." "Actually, it is," said a voice to their left. Gerald Webb had arrived at exactly the wrong moment, which was, Olivia understood, precisely the right one. Gerald was 70, silver-haired, and had the unruffled authority of a man who had been the most important person in many rooms and felt no need to announce it. "Daniel," He said the name with the finality of a closing argument. "The board has been trying to reach your attorney since this afternoon regarding the audit timeline. We need to resolve that before the evening's program begins." He glanced at Olivia with something that was not quite warmth, but was a form of respect. "Olivia Patricia wants you at her table for the donor acknowledgement portion. We've made some changes to the program that I think you'll find appropriate." Daniel stood for a moment between these two realities, the conversation he had come to control and the one that was actually happening, and she watched him understand that he was in neither of their centers. He was at the perimeter of a situation that had been resolved without him by people who had known Olivia far longer than they had trusted his management of the foundation she had helped build. He turned and walked away. Not dramatically. He simply turned and walked toward Raymond Cho, and the two of them moved toward the edge of the room, and Olivia watched him go and felt something she had to examine carefully before she could name it. It was not triumph. It was not relief. It was something quieter and stranger. The recognition of a woman who has carried a very heavy thing for a very long time and has finally set it down and is now noticing the absence of the weight in a way that feels unfamiliar. Not freedom yet. The understanding that freedom is possible, the first breath of it. "All right," Ethan asked beside her. "Ask me again in an hour," she said. He squeezed her hand once lightly and let it go. The program began at 8. The room filled and settled, and the first speaker took the podium. Olivia sat at Patricia's table with Renata to her left and Gerald across from her, and she listened to the Foundation's history being described by someone who had not always been in the room when that history was being made, and she thought about all the small, invisible acts that accumulate into the substance of a thing. All the phone calls and the careful seating arrangements and the donor relationships tended over years of showing up, all the work that doesn't appear on a letterhead. The gala screen came to life during the program's accountability segment, a transparency initiative the board had quietly implemented as part of the audit response. The information that appeared was not dramatic. It was not accusatory. It was factual, the findings of the special review presented clearly, without editorializing. Donor funds were accounted for. Irregularities were identified and were being addressed through a formal audit process. The Foundation's operational leadership was being restructured to ensure independence and accountability going forward. Numbers, dates, structures, just the truth laid out with the plainness that the truth sometimes needs. Across the room. Olivia watched Daniel's face as the slide changed. She watched him read the figures he had believed were hidden and understand that they were not. She watched him look at Raymond Cho, who looked away. She watched him look around the room at faces he had cultivated for years, the faces of people who had come to these events because of the Carter name and the Carter reputation and the Carter relationships that Olivia had spent 7 years nurturing, and she watched him understand that the room was not his. It had never been his. He had been a guest in something she built, and he had mistaken the welcome for ownership, and the mistake had cost him everything it could cost. He stood up from his table. Not with a scene Daniel Whitmore was too practiced for scenes. He stood and said something quietly to the woman beside him and walked toward the exit with the controlled pacing of a man managing a retreat. At the door he paused. He looked back across the ballroom. His eyes found Olivia. She met them, and she did not look away, and she did not soften the look, and she did not offer him anything. Not forgiveness, not cruelty. Just the clear, steady gaze of a woman who knew exactly who she was in that room and had nothing left to explain to him. He left. The door closed. The program continued. Beside Olivia, Renata Voss leaned over and said quietly in the tone she reserved for moments that mattered, "Eleanor would have loved to see this." Olivia put her hand over her grandmother's bracelet and held it there for a moment. "Yes," she said, "she would have." The evening moved forward. The auction proceeded. The donor acknowledgments were made. The Foundation's future, restructured, audited, and more transparent than it had been in years, was discussed with the careful optimism of people who believed in the work and wanted it to continue. Ethan found her during the interval between the program and dessert. He came to stand beside her without preamble and said, "How are you actually doing?" She considered that seriously. "I keep waiting to feel something specific," she said. "Something that tells me this is the moment, that this is the part where it resolves. And I think it doesn't work like that." She looked out across the room at the tables and the faces and the continuing conversation of a foundation that had survived the thing that was supposed to end it. I think it's just a series of ordinary moments, and somewhere in the middle of them, you realize you're already on the other side." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "For what it's worth, from the outside, you've been on the other side for a while. Some of us have been watching and waiting for you to notice." She looked at him. He looked back, steadily, honestly, in the way that had become, over 8 weeks of conversation, the thing she trusted most about him. "I noticed," she said. And somewhere on the other side of the city, a house on Ashburn Lane sat dark and full of someone else's memories waiting to become something new. The morning after the gala, Olivia woke up in her mother's old bedroom at Margaret's house and lay still for several minutes, listening to the ordinary sounds of the house settling around her. A radiator clicking, traffic on the street below, the distant sound of Margaret already moving in the kitchen, which meant the coffee was on and the legal pad was out, and the day had already begun, whether Olivia was ready for it or not. She stared at the ceiling and waited for the emotional aftermath she had been bracing for, the crash that she assumed would follow an evening of that magnitude, the grief or the guilt or the complicated vertigo of having stood in a room she had built and watched the man she had been married to walk out of it with nothing left to protect. But what came instead was something quieter, a kind of stillness she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. Not happiness exactly, not relief, though there was some of that, just the absence of the particular weight she had been carrying so consistently that she had stopped registering it as weight at all. It had simply been the baseline of her existence, the low-grade pressure of a life lived in service to someone else's narrative, and now the morning after the gala, she noticed its absence the way you notice a sound that has stopped, by the sudden presence of quiet. She got up, she dressed, she came downstairs. Margaret was at the table with her reading glasses on and her phone in one hand and her coffee in the other, which meant she was doing 3 things simultaneously, which was her natural state. She looked up when Olivia appeared in the doorway and said without preamble, "Claire Novak called at 7. The divorce documentation has been filed. Daniel's attorney acknowledged receipt at 8:45 last night, which means someone in that office was working late, which means Daniel called them from the gala parking lot." Olivia sat down, poured coffee. "What's the timeline?" Claire says 60 to 90 days given the asset complexity. Possibly faster if Daniel doesn't contest the restructuring terms, which she believes he won't, because contesting them means opening the financial irregularities to broader scrutiny than the audit already provides. Margaret set down her phone. "He's going to want this quiet." "He always wanted everything quiet," Olivia said. "Now it works in your favor instead of his." Olivia held her mug and thought about the documentation she had reviewed with Claire Novak over the past 2 months. The careful, methodical work of dismantling 12 years of shared financial life. The accounts and properties and foundations and obligations that had all been built under the assumption that she and Daniel were permanent, that the architecture of their life together would remain intact indefinitely. She thought about the house on Ashburn Lane. She had been thinking about it for weeks. Not with nostalgia, she was surprised to find there was very little of that, but with a kind of deliberate attention that felt like planning, like her mind was already working on something her conscious thoughts hadn't quite caught up to. "I want to talk to you about the house," she said. Margaret looked at her steadily. "I'm listening." "I want to keep it." A pause. "That's not the direction Claire was anticipating." "I know. She assumed I'd sell." Olivia set down her mug. "I don't want to sell. I want to transform it." She had thought about this for weeks, turning the idea over at night when she couldn't sleep, testing it for sentiment versus substance, asking herself repeatedly whether this was about the house or about something else, some need to reclaim territory, some stubborn insistence on writing the final chapter in the place where the story began. But every time she interrogated the idea, it came back solid, not emotional, practical, specific. "The Forward Path Initiative has a housing shortage," she said. "Ethan has been working with 3 transitional properties that between them house about 40 women and families at any given time. The need is twice that number. The wait list is 6 months long." She looked at Margaret. "The Ashburn Lane property is 4 bedrooms. The carriage house is a separate structure that could be converted, and the grounds are large enough to accommodate additional building. If it were donated to the initiative's housing arm and converted to a supported residential facility, it could serve 12 to 15 people at a time, with proper funding more." Margaret was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "You want to turn Daniel's house into a shelter," she said. I want to turn my house, Olivia said with a precision that was not aggressive, but was absolutely clear, into somewhere that actually means something. Margaret took off her reading glasses, set them down. You'd need the house to be in your name free and clear before you could donate it. That's part of the asset negotiation. I know, which is why I need Claire to make it a priority. She'll want to know this is serious and not grief-driven. Then tell her to call me, Olivia said. I'll walk her through the structural plans. Ethan's facilities director has already done a preliminary assessment. I asked him last week. Margaret looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a woman recalibrating something she thought she already understood. You've been planning this for a while. I've been thinking, Olivia said. There's a difference, but yes, longer than I admitted to myself. The call to Claire Novak happened that afternoon and lasted 45 minutes. Claire was professionally skeptical in the way that good attorneys are, which meant she asked hard questions and required specific answers, and refused to accept sentiment as a substitute for strategy. Olivia gave her specific answers. By the end of the call, Claire had shifted from skeptical to focused, which in Claire Novak's register was the equivalent of enthusiastic. The asset transfer is possible, Claire said. But Daniel has to agree to the house being part of your settlement. Given everything else on the table, it's possible he won't fight it. He's going to be focused on limiting the financial exposure from the audit. He's also going to want to be done with anything that has my name on it, Olivia said. I'm counting on that. Smart, Claire said, flatly as a fact. I'll call his attorney today. 2 days after that conversation, Ethan's phone rang while they were going over the Forward Path quarterly program report in his organization's conference room. He glanced at the screen, said, "Sorry, I have to take this," and stepped out. Olivia continued reviewing the housing waitlist numbers, which were as grim as they had been the week before, and she was still looking at them when Ethan came back in. He sat down across from her. He had an expression she was learning to read the particular set of his face when something significant had happened, and he was deciding how to present it. "What?" she said. "That was my facilities director. Daniel Whitmore's attorney called him this morning." Olivia went very still. Why would his attorney call your facilities director? Apparently Daniel has been making inquiries about the Forward Path initiative, about its housing program. He paused. About you. The word landed in the room between them with the weight of something deliberate. What kind of inquiries? Professional on the surface. He framed it as philanthropic interest. But the questions he asked were specifically about your involvement with the organization and whether you had any formal role. Ethan set his phone on the table. My director came to me immediately. He's been with the organization for 8 years, and he's a very perceptive man. He described the conversation as feeling like reconnaissance. Olivia felt the familiar shape of it. Daniel working the periphery of her life, the way he worked the periphery of every situation he didn't fully control. Gathering information, building a picture, looking for leverage. He wants to know what I'm doing, she said. Yes, because as long as he understands my next move, he can position himself relative to it. That's my read. She thought for a moment. Then she said, he's going to try to make a public gesture, something philanthropic, something that puts him in proximity to the same work so that the narrative becomes complicated, so that the story isn't. Olivia moved on and built something meaningful, and Daniel was held accountable for misconduct. It becomes two sides of the same coin, his redemption arc positioned alongside mine. Ethan looked at her with something that was frank admiration. You know how he thinks. I spent 12 years watching him think. She paused. We need to move faster on the housing proposal. If the Ashburn Lane transfer goes through, I want to announce it before he has time to construct an alternate narrative. How fast? As fast as Claire Novak can make it happen. Claire Novak, it turned out, could make it happen in 11 days. The asset negotiation moved with the kind of efficiency that only occurred when both parties wanted to be finished with each other, and the legal frameworks were already in place. Daniel's attorney, to Claire's measured surprise and Olivia's complete lack of it, agreed to the house and Olivia's settlement with almost no resistance. The conversation, as reported by Claire, had lasted 12 minutes. He said, and I'm quoting directly, Claire told Olivia on the phone that the house had nothing but bad memories and he had no interest in fighting over it. He's already working on a different story, Olivia said. Undoubtedly, but the legal result is the same. A pause. Olivia, the house is yours, fully, cleanly as of the settlement finalization. Congratulations. Olivia sat in Margaret's kitchen and held the phone in both hands after the call ended and breathed very carefully for about 30 seconds. Not because she was falling apart, because she was holding something enormous and needed to hold it correctly. The house was hers, and now she could do with it what it was always supposed to become. She called Ethan first. He picked up immediately. "It's done," she said. A pause. She could hear him stand up from whatever he'd been sitting in. "The house is yours." "As of the settlement finalization." Another pause. Then with a quietness that matched the magnitude of it. "Olivia, I know. When do you want to start?" "I already started," she said. "I've been designing the conversion for 3 weeks. I need to sit down with your facilities director this week and walk through the structural proposals. And I need to talk to Gerald Webb about the foundation contributing to the renovation funding. And I need to call Renata." Ethan laughed. It was the kind of laugh that came from genuine feeling. "You have been working on this for 3 weeks. I work better when I have a direction." "I've noticed," he said, and then more quietly, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "The house being back there, working inside it, making it something new. Is that going to be all right for you personally?" She had asked herself that question many times over the past weeks. She had walked through the answer from every direction she could find. "I think," she said slowly, "that the way to stop a place from being the location of something that hurt you is to make it the location of something that matters. You don't erase the memory, you make a newer, bigger one." A moment of quiet on his end. Then, "I think Eleanor would have liked that answer." She smiled. "Margaret says that about everything I do." Then Margaret is correct. The week that followed was the most productive Olivia could remember in years. Not because it was easy, it wasn't. There were structural assessments and legal documents and funding conversations and a board meeting at the Carter Foundation, her first in an official advisory capacity that required her to walk into a conference room full of people who had watched Daniel Whitmore leave a gala and had drawn their own conclusions, and to address those conclusions with the professional clarity of someone who intended to continue building the foundation's future, regardless of what the room chose to believe. The board meeting was the hardest thing she did that week. Not because the board was hostile, most of them were not, but because walking into a room as Olivia Carter advisory consultant, when she had spent 7 years walking into the same room as Olivia Whitmore co-chair, required a specific kind of recalibration that no amount of preparation fully eliminated. She was aware of every eye on her during the first 5 minutes. She was aware of the careful watching quality of the room's attention. She was aware that some of the people present had been Daniel's allies and were now being asked to reckon with what that alliance had cost. She opened her remarks without preamble. "I'm here to talk about the spring programming and the donor continuity strategy going forward," she said. "Not about the audit and not about the circumstances that led to the restructuring. Those matters are being handled appropriately, and they will resolve through appropriate channels. What concerns me this morning is the momentum of the Foundation's actual work, which has continued despite everything that has happened, and which will continue to define this organization long after the events of the past several months are memory." She looked around the table. The Carter Foundation was not built by one person. It was built by years of collective effort. I intend to make sure that effort is not lost. That's why I'm here. Patricia Haynes at the far end of the table said, "Then let's get to work." And they did. The board meeting lasted 3 hours. By the end of it, Olivia had secured the Foundation's commitment to a joint funding initiative with the Forward Path Housing Program, which was the piece that had been quietly at the center of her planning for weeks. The Foundation's charitable assets, which Daniel had been diverting from in small but meaningful ways, were not only intact, but positioned to be redirected toward programming that had always been the core of the Foundation's stated mission. Gerald Webb walked out with her afterward and said in the tone he used when he was being direct, "You know what you did in there, T. What? You gave them permission to care about the work again. They've been so tangled up in the institutional drama that they forgot why they showed up in the first place." He paused on the sidewalk outside. "Your grandmother would have been infuriated by all of this, and then she would have done exactly what you just did." Olivia thought about Eleanor. She thought about the bracelet which she wore every day now, not on special occasions every single day, because she had decided that the things that mattered should be with you always, and not saved for moments worthy of them. Because you couldn't know which moment was going to matter until you were already inside it. "Can I tell you something, Gerald? Always. When I left that house in April, when I walked out into the rain and got in the car and went to Margaret's. I thought I was walking away from everything, my life, my work, my identity, everything I had built. She paused. And then I started making phone calls, and people picked up, and they already knew my name. Not Daniel's name, mine. Gerald nodded. We always knew whose name was doing the work. I didn't know that you knew, she said. I thought I was invisible. No, he said simply. You were indispensable. There's a difference. He was the one who was invisible. We just couldn't say so. She drove back to Margaret's house in the late afternoon with the windows down, which was something she almost never did. She had always been careful about her hair, her appearance, the composed impression she made as a matter of professional habit. But the afternoon was warm, and the city was doing what Chicago did in late spring, throwing everything it had at you, the light and the wind, and the particular aliveness of a city that had been frozen for too long and was now remembering itself, and she drove with the windows down and let the wind do whatever it wanted. When she got back, Margaret was in the kitchen, and Ethan was there too. He had apparently arrived 20 minutes before having been invited by Margaret, under the pretext of discussing the housing conversion timeline, which was a pretext they all understood, but were collectively choosing to honor because Margaret Collins at 71 had earned the right to arrange things the way she saw fit. Olivia stood in the doorway and looked at the two of them at the table with papers spread between them and felt something so simple and so significant that she almost couldn't hold it. She felt at home. Not the home of the house on Ashburn Lane, which had been beautiful and empty and had required her perpetual performance. Not the home of a life structured around someone else's needs. This particular feeling, this kitchen, this woman who had known her since birth, this man who had met her 8 weeks ago and had been paying attention ever since. How was the board meeting? Margaret asked. Good, Olivia said. Really good. She came in and sat down. Did you two start on the conversion timeline without me? We got about as far as the carriage house, Ethan said. Your facilities notes are very detailed. I think in specifics when I can't sleep. I know. He said it with the ease of someone who had been paying attention for long enough to know things like that. The carriage house is structurally sound. With the right renovation, it could house 6 independently with shared community space. And the main building, 8 to 10 in a supported model with common areas on the ground floor. The bedroom count is right. It's the bathrooms that need significant work. He slid a page across the table. My director put together cost estimates. The foundation's contribution covers roughly 60% if Gerald's number holds. Gerald's number holds, Olivia said. He told me so directly. Then we're looking at a gap of approximately $40,000, which I can cover through Forward Path's Emergency Housing Fund, pending board approval, which I'll present Thursday. Will they approve it? Yes, he said with the certainty of someone who had built his organization over 15 years and knew exactly where its convictions lay. This is exactly what we're for. Margaret was watching them with the expression of a woman who was witnessing something she had been quietly hoping for and who was not going to say so directly because she respected both of them too much to be sentimental about it. But the expression was there in the corners of her eyes and the particular set of her mouth, and Olivia saw it and chose not to address it, which was its own form of acknowledgement. There's one more thing, Olivia said. She had been holding this piece for the right moment. This was the right moment. I want to name it, she said. The house, the facility, I want it to have a name. Ethan looked at her. What were you thinking? The Eleanor House, she said. For my grandmother. Silence. The good kind. The kind that came when words had landed exactly where they were supposed to. Margaret made a sound that was not quite a word and stood up from the table and went to the kitchen counter with her back to both of them, and the line of her shoulders said everything she wasn't going to say out loud. Ethan said quietly, That's right. She left this city 100 women who were better for having known her, Olivia said. She would have done what I'm doing. In fact, she paused. In fact, Margaret tells me she did, in her own way. I didn't know that until April. Eleanor sounds like someone I would have wanted to know. She would have liked you, Olivia said. She had excellent judgment about people. She paused. So does Margaret, for what it's worth. From the kitchen counter, without turning around, Margaret said, I am right here. Olivia smiled. I know. The thing that happened 3 days later was something none of them had anticipated, which was that Daniel called again. Not his attorney, not a mutual acquaintance. He called Olivia directly on a Wednesday afternoon, and she was sitting in what would eventually become the first residence room at the Eleanor house, holding a measuring tape and trying to calculate whether the space could accommodate a small desk alongside a single bed when the phone rang. She almost didn't answer. She answered. "I heard about the house," he said. His voice was different from the last time. The anger was gone. What replaced it was harder to categorize something that might have been genuine, but that she had been taught by 12 years of experience to examine carefully before accepting. "Then you know the settlement's been finalized," she said. "I know." A pause. "The Eleanor house." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. She waited. "That's a good name," he said. It came out sounding like something it cost him. She didn't respond. "I'm not calling to contest anything," he said quickly, "or to ask for anything. A pause. Longer this time. The kind of pause that in the old days she would have filled for him, completed his sentences, smoothed the difficulty. She didn't fill it. "I wanted you to know that I understand why the board found what they found. I told myself for a long time that what I was doing was within acceptable limits. And it wasn't. And I knew it wasn't. And I did it anyway because I always assumed there would be time to address it later, and because the consequences never arrived, and because—" He stopped. "Because you trusted that I would absorb them," she said. A long silence. "Yes," he said, very quietly. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm not angry at you, Daniel. I'm angry at myself for how long I made it possible." She paused. "Are you genuinely trying to do something different? Or is this call about managing what people think of you?" A silence that told her he was actually considering the question, which surprised her. "I don't know yet," he said finally. "I think it's both. I think I'm not in a place where I can entirely separate the two." It was the most honest thing he had said to her in years, maybe ever. "Then that's where you start," she said, "with the not knowing." She looked at the empty room around her, the bare walls, the window, the floor that was going to need refinishing. All of it waiting to become something. "I have to go. I'm measuring rooms." "For the house. For the house." Another silence. Then with something that sounded like it came from a place he didn't visit often. "I'm glad it's going to be something good." She believed him, which surprised her. "Goodbye, Daniel," she said. She hung up. She sat in the empty room for a moment with the measuring tape in her hand, and she thought about all the versions of that conversation she had imagined over the past months. The angry version, the cold version, the version where he was manipulative and she was armored. This version with its honesty and its imperfection, and its small specific moment of a man saying he didn't know, was not one she had scripted. It had arrived on its own, the way things arrived when you stopped managing every outcome. She got up, measured the room, wrote down the dimensions. Then she called Ethan. "He called," she said when he answered. "A moment. How was it?" "Strange and real, and I'm glad I picked up." She looked at the numbers she'd written. "The room fits a desk and a bed with space left over. Tell your director we can go wider on the storage." "I'll tell him," Ethan said. A pause. "Olivia." "Yes." "I'm proud of you." It landed differently than she expected it to. Not like praise which she had received from people her whole life and had always deflected without quite meaning to, like something offered between equals, like a statement of fact from someone who had watched her work and was saying simply, "I see what you did, and it matters." "Thank you," she said, and meant it without deflecting. She drove back to Margaret's house in the early evening with the windows down again, and the city was doing its thing again, and she thought about Eleanor, and about the bracelet on her wrist, and about the room that was going to become someone's beginning, and she thought about what her grandmother had said, the thing Margaret had told her in the kitchen, on the very first night that Eleanor had done this too, in her own way, in her own time, and had never talked about it much. She had never talked about it much because the women who built things quietly, specifically, without requiring the room's attention, rarely did. But the things they built remained. And tonight, Olivia Carter drove through a city that was warm and late and fully alive, and she felt for the first time without qualification the word she had been moving toward for months: free. Not the dramatic version of it. Not the one that arrived with strings and trumpets and a clear moment of cinematic resolution. The real version. The one that arrived at dusk on an ordinary Wednesday through a car window while you were thinking about paint colors for a room that was going to shelter someone who needed it. That kind. The kind that stayed. The first woman to move into the Eleanor house was named Carol. She was 54 years old, a former school librarian from the South Side, and she arrived on a Tuesday morning in late July with 2 garbage bags of belongings and a 12-year-old daughter named Maya, who held her mother's hand and did not let go. Olivia was there when they arrived, not because she needed to be, not because there was any official ribbon cutting or ceremonial opening that required her presence, but because she had spent 4 months building this moment, and she wanted to be inside it when it happened. Carol stood in the doorway of the room that Olivia had measured on the afternoon. Daniel called the room with the desk and the bed and the storage space. The facilities director had widened based on Ethan's instructions, and she looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Maya pressed against her mother's side. Carol's hand found her daughter's shoulder. "This is ours," Carol said. "This is yours," Olivia said, "for as long as you need it." Carol turned and looked at her with the expression of a woman who had been told so many things were temporary that she had stopped believing in permanence. "Nobody's going to take it away." "Nobody's going to take it away," Olivia said. Carol nodded once very precisely, like someone accepting information she intended to verify over time. Then she walked into the room, set her garbage bags down on the floor with the deliberateness of someone claiming territory, and said to Maya, "Which side do you want?" Maya looked at the 2 sides of the room, pointed to the one by the window. "Then that's yours," Carol said. Olivia stepped back into the hallway and stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of a woman and her daughter choosing a side of a room, and she felt the thing she had been building toward the thing she had been circling since April, with the patience of someone who knew it was real, but couldn't rush it, settle into her chest and stay there. This was what it was for. Not the gala, not the documents, not the legal resolution, or the financial restructuring, or even the conversation where Daniel had said things she'd never expected him to say. This, a woman and her daughter choosing sides. She called Ethan from the hallway. He picked up on the first ring. "How is it?" "She's here," Olivia said. "She asked if anyone was going to take it away." A pause on his end. She heard him exhale. "What did you tell her?" "The truth." "Good." A moment of quiet. "I'm finishing up with the board report. I can be there in an hour if you need me." "I'm all right," she said. And then, because it was true, and she was done withholding the true things, "I'm better than all right." "I know," he said. "I could hear it." By the end of August, 5 of the Eleanor house's 8 residential units were occupied. Ethan's facilities director, a man named Vincent, who had the methodical patience of someone who had spent 8 years turning impossible logistics into workable realities, managed the intake process with the Forward Path team, while Olivia worked the funding side with Gerald Webb and Renata Voss and the Carter Foundation's newly restructured grants committee. The money was not easy. It never was. But the relationships she had built over 7 years of foundation work turned out to be exactly what she had told Gerald and Renata. They were real, durable, personal. Donors who had been giving to the Carter Foundation out of loyalty to the Whitmore name reconsidered. Donors who had been giving because of Olivia stayed. New donors arrived drawn by the Eleanor House, specifically by the specificity of what it was trying to do and the clarity of the person leading it. Renata Voss wrote the first major check personally. She didn't make an event of it. She brought it to a lunch at the same restaurant on the Gold Coast where they had been meeting 4 times a year, set it on the table beside the breadbasket and said, "For the carriage house renovation. Vincent says another 6 residents once it's done." Olivia picked up the check. The number on it required a moment. "Renata, don't thank me," Renata said. "Use it." The carriage house renovation began in September, in the weeks between the Eleanor House opening and the carriage house groundbreaking. Something else was happening that Olivia was only partly paying attention to because she was very busy and because she had learned over the course of this year to stop managing things that didn't require management. What was happening was Ethan. Not dramatically. Not with declarations or urgency or the performed intensity that she had come to associate after 12 years with what a relationship was supposed to look like. It was happening in the particular ordinary way that real things happened through conversations that started about one thing and became about something else, through the specific attention of a man who noticed what she needed before she named it, through the accumulation of small moments that were unremarkable individually and entirely significant in total. He had been at the Eleanor House the morning Carol arrived. He had been at the Carter Foundation board meetings. He had been in Margaret's kitchen on more evenings than could be attributed to professional need. Margaret had stopped pretending the visits were primarily about the housing program about 6 weeks in and had begun simply setting 3 places for dinner when she heard his car. One evening in early October, after the third resident family had moved in and the carriage house framing was up and the Carter Foundation audit had formally concluded with the findings Olivia and Margaret had first identified in April, they were sitting on the back steps of the Eleanor house, going over program notes in the dark, because they had both forgotten to go home, and Ethan closed the folder he was holding and said without preamble, "I want to ask you something." "Ask?" she said. "Are you happy?" She looked at him. The question was simple enough that she almost deflected it, almost reached for the measured, considered response that years of public-facing composure had trained her to produce. But she had been practicing all year the discipline of not doing that. "Yes," she said. "I think so. Not the way I thought it would feel. It's not big. It's not like an arrival. It's more like I keep noticing I'm fine and then being surprised by it. That's what it feels like when it's real," he said, "as opposed to performed." "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. He looked back in the direct, unhurried way she had come to rely on. "You've been very patient with me," she said. "I've been present," he said. "There's a difference. Patient implies waiting for something. I'm not waiting. I'm exactly where I want to be." She thought about what she would have done with a statement like that 12 months ago, how she would have managed it, redirected it, kept it at the appropriate professional distance, protected herself from the risk of needing someone who turned out to be unavailable. All the careful, self-protective habits of a woman who had been burned by her own trust. She thought about Carol in the room upstairs, choosing sides. "I am too," she said, "exactly where I want to be." What happened the following week was the twist that none of them had seen coming, and it arrived not from Daniel, not from the audit, not from any of the directions Olivia had been watching, but from a phone call on a Thursday morning from a number she didn't recognize. The woman on the other end identified herself as a producer for a Chicago-based public affairs program called Cornerstone. The program covered philanthropic and civic initiatives in the greater Chicago area and had a viewership of several 100,000. The producer said they had been following the Eleanor House story through their contacts at the Carter Foundation and were interested in doing a feature segment. Olivia's first instinct was no. She had spent the year deliberately avoiding the version of this story that became a story about her. She was not interested in being a narrative. She was interested in the work. She had turned down 2 interview requests already, both from journalists who had framed the pitch around Daniel and the gala and the public confrontation, and she had turned them down because that framing was not what she was building, and she refused to let someone else's lens define the definition. "What's the angle?" she said, because she owed it to herself to ask. "The Eleanor House itself," the producer said. "Carol Miller agreed to speak on the record with her daughter. She specifically requested that we also include you. She said, and I'm quoting the woman who built this place, deserves to have people know her name." Olivia sat with that for a moment. Carol, who had stood in the doorway with 2 garbage bags and asked if anyone was going to take it away. Carol wanted people to know Olivia's name. "What would the segment cover?" she asked. "The founding, the Forward Path Partnership, the Carter Foundation's role, the physical transformation of the property." A pause. "We're not interested in the divorce or in Daniel Whitmore's situation. That's not our focus." "I want to see the questions in advance," Olivia said. "Of course. And I want Carol's segment to air before mine. This is her story to tell first." A brief silence that indicated the producer was slightly surprised, and then, "Absolutely. We can structure it exactly that way." She called Ethan immediately. "A TV segment," she said. "Public affairs program. Carol wants to do it." "Then you do it," he said without hesitation. "You don't think it's too much?" "I think Carol made her own decision about her own story," he said. "And I think the Eleanor House deserves the attention. And I think you've been careful enough about your own visibility that it's not going to read as self-promotion. It's going to read as someone who built something real." "You sound very certain." "I've watched you work for 6 months," he said. "I'm certain." She agreed to the interview. It filmed on a Wednesday morning at the Eleanor House. The crew was small, a producer, a camera operator, a sound person, and they moved through the space with the particular care of people who understood they were in someone's home. Carol was extraordinary. She sat in the common room downstairs and talked about her daughter and about the night she had called the Forward Path Crisis Line, and about what it had meant to walk through the door of a place that was not temporary. She talked about Olivia without Olivia being in the room, and when the segment aired 3 weeks later, and Olivia watched it for the first time in Ethan's office, she had to stop the playback twice. Carol said, "I don't know her whole story. I know bits of it. I know she lost something and built something better in its place. I know that the room my daughter and I sleep in used to be part of someone else's life, and I think that's the whole point. That you can take the place where someone broke you and turn it into the place where someone else heals." Olivia sat in Ethan's office and pressed her hand over her mouth and held it there. Ethan didn't say anything. He reached over and put his hand on top of hers and left it there. After a moment, she said, "She articulated it better than I ever have." "Yes," he said. "I've been trying to explain it to myself for months, and she did it in 45 seconds. People who have lived something understand it differently than people who built it," he said. "You need both." The segment aired on a Friday evening, and by Saturday morning, Olivia's phone had logged 47 messages. Not from journalists, the producer had fielded that. From women all over Chicago and beyond who had watched Carol speak and had recognized something, and who wanted to know if there was a way to help or a way to access, or simply needed to say that they had seen it and that it had mattered. She sat in Margaret's kitchen on that Saturday morning reading message after message, and Margaret sat across from her drinking coffee and not saying anything, and the phone kept producing notifications, and Olivia kept reading. Finally, Margaret said, "You're going to need a bigger house." Olivia looked up. "The Ashburn Lane property has a lot next door," Margaret said with the precision of a woman who had been thinking about this longer than she was admitting. "It's been empty for 2 years. Gerald Webb mentioned the owner is considering an offer." Olivia stared at her. "I may have already asked Gerald to make some inquiries," Margaret said. "Margaret, you were busy filming a television segment." Olivia set down her phone. She looked at the woman across from her, the woman who had opened her door in the rain and made tea and stayed up all night writing notes on a legal pad, and had been for every single day of the 7 months since the foundation of everything. "What would I have done without you?" Margaret looked at her steadily. "You would have been fine. You would have taken longer, and you would have been lonelier, and you would have been fine. You're Eleanor's granddaughter." She picked up her coffee. "But I'm glad you didn't have to do it that way." The inquiry about the neighboring lot was not yet resolved when something else arrived that Olivia had not been expecting. Daniel called one more time. It was a Saturday afternoon in November, 8 months after the night she had walked out of the house in the rain, 7 months after the gala, 6 months after the Eleanor house had opened its doors. She was in the carriage house with Vincent reviewing the final punch list before the renovation was declared complete and the first residents could move in. Her phone rang, and she looked at the screen and said, "I need to take this," and stepped outside. "Hi," he said. "Hi." A silence that was different from all the previous ones, not charged, not strategic, just quiet the way a conversation was quiet when both people had run out of angles. "I saw the segment," he said. She waited. "Carol," he paused. "She said something about the room, about taking the place where someone broke you." "I know what she said." "I've been thinking about it for 2 weeks. His voice was careful in a way that was not the old careful, not managed. Uncertain. "I wanted you to know that I understand now what I cost you. Not just the things I did, the things I required you to be, the person I made you disappear into." He stopped. "I know that saying so doesn't change anything." "It doesn't," she agreed. "But I'm glad you understand it." "Are you happy?" he asked. The same question Ethan had asked her on the back steps. "Yes," she said, with the same honesty. "Are you?" The pause that followed was very long. "I'm working on it," he said finally. "I think that's the most honest answer I've given anyone in a long time." "Then it's a good start," she said. She meant it. After she hung up, she stood outside the carriage house for a moment in the November air, and she thought about everything she had carried into this year and everything she had set down along the way. She thought about the bracelet on her wrist and her grandmother's voice from a hospital corridor 17 years ago. She thought about Margaret at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning with a legal pad. She thought about Renata raising her glass across a ballroom. She thought about Carol and Maya choosing sides. She thought about Ethan. She went back inside to finish the punch list. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday in early December, the carriage house opened. 6 new residents, 3 families, Two single mothers, one woman who had arrived from downstate Illinois with nothing but the clothes she was wearing, and a referral from a crisis counselor who had driven her to Chicago personally because there had been nowhere closer with space. Her name was June. She was 61 years old, and she had the expression of someone who had been afraid for a very long time and was only beginning to understand that the fear was allowed to stop. Olivia walked her to her room herself. June stood in the doorway and looked at the space that had been 4 months ago a storage room in a crumbling carriage house and was now something clean and specific and hers. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she turned to Olivia and said, "How did you know to build this?" Olivia thought about the question. She thought about an April night and a rain-soaked driveway and a car service number dialed in the dark. She thought about 12 years of making her pain invisible and the moment she had finally decided to stop. "I needed somewhere to go," she said, "and there wasn't anywhere." June looked at her. Then she nodded the way Carol had nodded with the precision of someone accepting information she intended to verify over time. She walked into the room. She set her bag on the bed. She went to the window and looked out. "It's good," she said. "It's really good." Olivia closed the door softly and walked down the hall and out into the December air, and Ethan was waiting on the front steps of the main house because she had texted him when June arrived, and he had said simply on his way. He stood up when she came out. "How is she?" She said, "It's really good." Olivia stopped in front of him. "She asked how I knew to build this." "What did you tell her?" "The truth." She looked at him. December was cold in Chicago, the way December was always cold in Chicago, not politely, not gently, but with the full conviction of a city that did not apologize for its winters. She was warm anyway. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "Tell me." "The lot next door. Margaret's inquiry came back. The owner will sell." Ethan went very still. "How big?" "Big enough for a second building, purpose-built. 12 to 15 additional residents with programming space on the ground floor." She paused. "We'd need a capital campaign, something significant. I've been drafting it in my head for 3 weeks." He looked at her with the expression she had come to know as his clearest one, not the professional consideration, not the measured evaluation, the one where he was just looking at her directly without any management between them. "Do you ever stop?" he asked. "I used to stop all the time," she said. "I stopped for 12 years. I spent 12 years making myself smaller so someone else could feel bigger." She paused. "I'm done stopping." He stepped forward. He reached up and touched the bracelet on her wrist, not taking her hand, just briefly, specifically the bracelet, Eleanor's bracelet, the one that had started all of this on the night a stranger wore it by a fireplace, and something in Olivia finally irrevocably woke up. "She'd be proud of you," he said. "She'd be in here reorganizing the intake forms," Olivia said, "and telling us the common room furniture is wrong." He laughed. She laughed. December air and the sound of a city that kept going no matter what, and two people standing in front of a building that had been something hollow and was now something alive. "I love you," he said. Simple, specific, in the way he did everything without performance, without strategy, without asking her to be anything other than exactly what she was. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about all the years she had confused being needed with being loved, the years she had given and called it partnership, and wondered why she felt so alone. She thought about the rain and the driveway, and the moment she had stopped making her pain convenient for someone else. She thought about everything it had cost her to get here, and everything she had gained in its place, and she understood with the clarity of a woman who had stopped lying to herself about anything at all, that what was in front of her was real. "I love you too," she said. He took her hand. They stood there while December moved around them, and the Eleanor house settled behind them with the particular warmth of a building that was full of people who needed it. And somewhere inside, Maya was probably doing homework by the window she had chosen, and June was probably still standing in her room looking at things that were hers. And somewhere in the city, the Carter Foundation was planning its next grant cycle, and the Forward Path Initiative was preparing its next program report. And Margaret Collins was probably at her kitchen table with a legal pad solving something that hadn't asked to be solved yet. The world continued, and Olivia Carter stood in it whole, specific, and entirely her own. She had not won by destroying the man who underestimated her. She had not won by making him pay. She had won by refusing finally and permanently to be the version of herself that required his approval to exist. She had won by walking out into the rain and letting herself be finished. by picking up the phone when the right people called, by building the thing that needed to be built in the place where she had been diminished, and filling it with people who needed it, and standing in front of it without apology. She had won by becoming completely and without remainder the woman she had always been underneath the performance. The woman Eleanor Carter had recognized 30 years ago and pressed a bracelet into the palm of and said, "This is not jewelry. This is the part of me that doesn't die." It didn't die. It walked out into December and held someone's hand and looked at something it had built and knew, without having to be told, that it was enough, more than enough. It was everything. And nothing that had ever tried to make it small could touch it now.